Welcome to the second part of our RFP toolkit, which is looking at project planning. When you are planning an IoT project, it's really important that you understand the strategic positioning of the IoT solution, because that has a really huge impact on the project setup, the project plan, the procurement strategy, and so on. There's two key dimensions you need to look at. One is the depth of enterprise integration. So is this a relatively isolated solution, or is this really becoming embedded into the core of your application landscape? And the second dimension is the potential of the IoT solution as a competitive differentiator. So if both dimensions are low, then typically we would call this more an enabling IoT solution, where, for example, in terms of setting up your project plan, you can plan for extensive external sourcing, or maybe even an off-the-shelf solution that's delivered and operated as a turnkey solution. The other extreme, obviously, is a highly strategic, deeply embedded IoT solution where your external sourcing options will be much more limited. And especially from a long-term maintenance point of view, you have to make sure that you can really control this application. So that's really what you need to look at the beginning of your planning process. And then when you look at the typical planning process for an IoT solution, there's typically two main phases. The first one is what we call idea to funding. So here we're talking about, for example, working with RIC to execute test beds, challenges, and so on. Develop your business model, for example, using the RIC business model builder and so on. Trying this out in terms of lightweight proof of concepts or prototype projects, etc. But at some point in time, you will be going beyond the initial lower funding to really scaling this up, requiring the funding that's required to really fund a large-scale development process. And this is typically where your RFP process starts. This is not black and white. Sometimes you have the POCs or prototypes after the RFP. Sometimes you have them before the RFP. In a lot of cases, you have smaller prototypes with very limited scope and funding before the RFP, and then as part of the vendor evaluation in the late stage of your RFP process, you engage, for example, in one or two or even three pilot projects to work with your most likely vendors. And then from there, you basically enter the typical plan, build, run phase of a large enterprise project, obviously combining this with agile aspects. Typically, what's also different about an IoT solution is that you have a combination of your solution go live, so for example, a typical cloud solution, together with your manufacturing start of production. So for example, you are producing assets which are now equipped with extra sensors or actuators, etc., that are talking to your cloud solution. So all of this needs to be well understood. From a procurement point of view, this plan is where your procurement process needs to be embedded. And as I said earlier on, you have to engage with the team that is executing the entire project to make sure that the other milestones like prototypes, pilots, etc., are staged around the actual RFP process. So how does an ideal IoT solution procurement process look like? We have identified 4 phases. The first one is project planning, which includes project scope definition and stakeholder integration, dealing with your IoT solution requirements, managing the project timeline, milestones, setting up the budget, sourcing scope definition, creating your initial vendor profiles, defining the sourcing criteria, and defining the sourcing process. And we'll look at all of this in more detail in a second. optional. Sometimes you want to have an RFI process, request for information, that allows you to reach out to a broader set of vendors and then, based on the results of the RFI phase, basically narrow down on the set of most likely vendors as part of a vendor pre-qualification. Then you have the actual RFP creation phase where you create your RFP draft and review it with your key stakeholders, including your business stakeholders and sponsors, management, procurement, legal, and so on. And typically also get final management approval of the RFP process before actually distributing it. The actual RFP distribution process is not only related to making sure that the RFP is reaching the most relevant vendors, but also making sure that they are engaged. Typically, no RFP document is perfect. There will be some questions, so you will have to have a structured Q&A process and so on. And then based on the inputs that you're getting for your RFP, we have the last phase, the vendor selection process, where you evaluate the responses to the RFP. You do typically some kind of vendor pre-selection. You have the most likely candidates present to you. You will have a short list, and then potentially, as we discussed earlier on, you will go into a deep dive with your most likely candidates to a POC or even a full-scale pilot project before you come to the final selection. Okay, so let's start by looking at the scope of your IoT solution. What is it that you actually need to procure? So typically, an IoT solution has some elements which are deployed in the field, where your assets or appliances are deployed, and then some components which are deployed in the backend, can be in the cloud, can be on-premise. So let's look at each of these in turn. Number A, we have sensors and actuators. Number B, we have some business logic deployed in the field on your edge platform. That's in a lot of cases custom developed business logic. Number C is the edge platform that provides you with local connectivity, local compute capabilities, local storage. And then number D is the communication link to the backend. So this is typically a service rendered by a telecommunication company to you and is augmented by some IoT specific middleware. Once you reach the backend, you typically again have custom application logic, so your IoT backend application, that's number E. In most cases, an IoT solution is not standalone. So number F is services that you will have to acquire that help you integrating your IoT backend application with your existing enterprise applications. All of this needs to run on a platform. So number G is your typical IoT middleware or platform as a service. And then number H is your infrastructure as a service if you're running in the cloud. So roughly speaking, A to H are the different components or elements or resources that you will have to acquire for your project. Okay, so now we have roughly defined the scope of our solution that we want to procure. The next step is to create a more refined bill of material of all the different things that we need to acquire. Or is it actually a bill of material? Is it more a project where we have a work breakdown structure? In IoT, it's probably going to be a little bit of both. So typically we have hardware elements, we have custom software, and we have infrastructure. So your sensors and actuators clearly are hardware, your field application logic, your backend logic, and the enterprise application integration is custom software, and then the rest is more infrastructure that you're acquiring. So each of these different things is going to have different sources that you need to source them from, and also different levels of readiness when you buy them. So some of this is going to be fully ready-made, commercial off the shelf. Others are custom solutions where you actually need to acquire, for example, a system integrator to deliver this for you. It's also really important to understand how all of this is then mapping against your project setup. So when you look at this from the project manager, he typically will run his IoT project as a scaled agile project, where at the top he has one work stream that deals with project management, and then he has different solution teams and different work streams that deal with different aspects. So cross-cutting elements of the project, solution infrastructure and operations environment, then the actual backend services, the communication services, and then the on-asset components. And then last but not least, if the IoT solution really is implemented against a physical asset, you will have another work stream that's, for example, called asset preparation. So the different elements that we looked at earlier on, so for example, number A, B, C, map to the work stream on asset components. Then you have D, communication services. E and F goes into backend services, and then G and H is your solution infrastructure and operations environment. That's important to understand also from the point of view of the procurement manager, because that's the framework that your project manager is operating under. And you have to help him to understand what are the best potential sources to basically acquire what he needs in these different work streams. So what should he basically take from internal resources? Where would he typically get best support from a management consultancy? Where would a system integrator be of best help, for example, for the custom software? Where do you buy components from a commercial off-the-shelf software vendor? Where do you buy components from a cloud provider? Where do you actually need a more manufacturing-oriented engineering company or an actual manufacturer to manufacture certain elements for you? Is this something that you're going to source individually, or are you more looking at a turnkey solution, in which case the whole detailed project management would be done actually by your general contractor? So the make versus buy decision is really crucial, and we have developed here, with the help of our IIC partners from PwC, a make versus buy decision matrix that's fed by a set of levers that you can basically analyze and adjust for your project. So for example, what's the solution fit with the required buyer capabilities? How much time is available to build the solution? How relevant is any kind of provider brand for you? What are the providers' routes to market that could support you, and so on. So if you take all of these different questions and you map them to the different components, again labeled A to H here, that you are acquiring, you can easily map this to a quadrant that shows you on the one side impact and differentiation, as we have discussed earlier on, but also the build level of effort. And with every good quadrant, you want to look at typically what's in the upper right corner, where you have a high build level of effort, but also a high level of differentiation. This is most likely something where you want to partner or buy, or if the impact or differentiation is not as high, you can look at identifying partner synergies and so on. In areas where the build effort is more moderate, you then basically look at doing this with your internal resources. So this is just one example. Most likely this quadrant will look differently for your own project. But that's a key analysis that you have to perform for your own project. Another thing that's really important is to answer the question, how do you properly stage the procurement process, especially if you're not looking at a turnkey solution? So this will heavily depend on the make versus buy discussion that we just had. It will also heavily depend on whether this is a greenfield versus a brownfield project. So for example, if it's more like a brownfield project, then most likely you'll be looking at an infrastructure first type of project, yeah, where you basically do the technology evaluation and procurement first before then making a decision, for example, on a system integrator that's delivering you the development and potentially also the operations and maintenance of the solution. That can be different if you have more of a greenfield type of solution where you have the luxury of maybe first bringing on the DevOps team and then together with the DevOps team running the second stage of the procurement process, which is looking at technology evaluation and procurement. Or naturally, you can combine all of this and source a complete turnkey solution. Let's have just a quick look at one particular project phase, which we just discussed, which is staffing of the DevOps team. Now, if you are planning to basically have the initial version of your solution built by an external provider, for example, a system integrator, but then you are planning to actually maintain the solution in-house, then it's really key that when you look at the two sub-processes here, the staffing of the development team versus the staffing of the maintenance team, you might want to consider, for example, to have some of your own people embedded in the development team or vice versa, have some people from the system integrators development team embedded in your maintenance team for some time. Again, that's something that you need to already articulate in the RFP document and process, because that obviously has going to have an impact on the offers you will receive, the pricing, and so on. Last but not least, a key question that you need to be able to answer is what kind of pricing model should you be using? So is it actually contract work? So even if you're working with a system integrator, do you want to get very specific SLAs? Do you want to get maintenance commitments? Do you want to get specific warranties, etc.? That type of setup is better suited also for a fixed price type of model. However, the challenge there obviously being how do you actually arrive at a suitably stable and comprehensive set of requirements versus the basic time and material approach, where you most likely will not get built into this initial offering the SLAs, the maintenance commitments. Or are you actually looking more at a hybrid version of this, which is combining some elements of a fixed price model with a basic time and material model? So for example, time and material combined with a cost ceiling, and then in a later stage, once the solution is more mature and it's easier for both sides, the supplier and yourselves, to get to firm agreements regarding the SLAs, the maintenance commitments, etc. So for this, most likely you will have to apply a staged approach. So these are your options, and you have to, as part of your project plan, of course, make sure that you early on agree on what's best for your own needs.